Thank you so much for coming tonight. This is the last speaker series in our 2018 lineup. And on the back of your program, you'll get a taste of some of the exciting events that we have planned in 2019. And I hope you'll come back and join us for those. This is an exciting time of year at the Franklin Institute. We've got lots of holiday events planned for adults and families, as well as our temporary exhibition about the technology and culture of Vikings, which is here through March. So I encourage you to follow us on social media to stay up to date on everything that's going on. Now, all of these programs, as well as things like our youth programs and our sensory-friendly Sundays, are made possible by a really generous community of supporters. So I'd like to thank our members, our donors, and all of you for making these programs possible. Tonight's event is actually the last in a series of events that we've held in November, all about the role of food in our culture and society and the science that underlies it. And we're fortunate tonight to be joined by two experts, Dr. Nancy Rawson from the Monell Chemical Senses Center and Dr. Shiriki Kumanyika from the Dornsife School of Public Health at Drexel University. And both of them are experts on food, but they come to the topic from two very different lenses. And I'm excited to have you join our conversation as we think about both the science of the senses as well as how our food preferences and the psychology of food influence even policy and marketing. Now, when it comes to the science of food, I spend a lot of time thinking about the brain because a lot of our programming here at the Franklin Institute is around brain science. And from reading a lot of pop culture articles about the brain and food, you kind of think that all of our problems would be solved by a Mediterranean diet. Now, my Thanksgiving dinner notwithstanding, if I look at the choices that I make every day, I can tell you that it is really hard to stick to a Mediterranean diet because there are so many other influences at play. And even when it comes to the science, there are actually lots of questions that can sometimes be confusing to the public, but actually still have a lot of controversy among scientists. This magazine is last week's issue of Science magazine and focused on exactly this topic of diet and health. And some of the unanswered questions that were explored in this issue include things like high fat versus low fat. Yes, we're still talking about this. We still don't have one concrete answer for this. Things like, what's up with the microbiome? You hear all about your gut flora. How does that affect your nutrition? What about, does fasting help? There are all these fad diets that talk about constraining your food consumption to one part of the day. Does that have any evidence as far as benefiting our health? Or what's the best diet for athletes? Whether you're a weekend warrior or a professional athlete, there's all sorts of advice about how you should structure your diet. And these are just some of the questions that are out there that scientists are still trying to figure out the answers to. Today, we're going to tackle a small part of this problem, and we're really going to focus on things about sensory perception and psychology of food, and then thinking about how that then translates to the decisions that we make, both as individuals, as communities, and as a larger society. And this is something that's very relevant here in Philadelphia, because as much as we like to talk about nutrition and the benefits for health, it's also a question of access. And so this is data from our city here, where you can see the distribution of walkable access to healthy food. And those regions that are in green have high access. And you can see that a large part of the city is actually in that red and yellow area, where even if people wanted to eat healthy food, the decision is made harder by the environment that they live in. So these are some of the questions that we're going to tackle today. So I'd first like to welcome Dr. Nancy Rawson from Monell, who's going to tell us a little bit about sensory nutrition.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Jayatri. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank all of you, too, for coming out on this lovely evening in the rain. So what I'm going to tell you about this evening is some work that really gives me some hope that we actually can make a difference and we can move our diets towards a healthier pattern. We know that the diet-associated diseases, obesity, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, are really huge issues today. And it seems like our chemical senses, our senses of taste and smell, really drive us to prefer the things that are worst for us. How many people had pumpkin pie and apple pie recently? Okay, was that not the best part of the meal, right? Even though you were really full, you still had to have that pie, right? Am I right? Yeah. So, so what we do at Monell is study the chemical senses of taste and smell. And I think that what I'm really excited about is the fact that Shiriki and I are on the same platform, because it's by combining our understanding of our senses with nutrition and public health that we'll actually be able to move the needle on these important diseases. So the factors influencing our diet are really complicated. And we'll hear a little bit more later on about things like social environment and culture and so forth. But what I'm going to be focusing on and what we do at Monell is, as I said, our flavor perception and the factors that drive our preferences for different types of food. So to give you a little bit of background, flavor is really multisensory. It involves not just, it involves the sight, smell, taste, hearing. The crunch of a potato chip is important, is just as important as the saltiness of the potato chip. But the most ancient of these senses is actually our chemical senses of taste and smell. These senses evolved to detect chemicals in our external and our internal environment, and even the most primitive single-cell organisms have systems designed to detect the chemicals in their environment and use these systems to determine whether they should approach a chemical stimulus, eat it, or avoid it. The newest information is that these same systems, or systems that are using the same receptors and detector mechanisms, are present throughout our body, not just in our nose and mouth. And they work throughout the gut, in the lungs, in the nose, and they play also very important roles there in sensing our chemical environment and controlling our metabolism and our immune function. So if we think about taste for a moment, taste is sort of, I think of it as our gatekeeper sense. It's the last chance we have to decide whether something is going to be swallowed or spit out. And so if a food item is sweet or salty or umami, which is this protein, meaty type of flavor sensation, these qualities signal nutrients that are essential for human life, and they're generally preferred. Things that are sour could be preferred if it's a low concentration of sourness. It might signal certain vitamins. But if it's a high concentration, it might signal food spoilage and not be so preferred. And bitter is often a signal for things that might be toxic at high concentrations, and so generally is disliked. However, the interesting thing with bitter is that we can actually learn to like it in certain contexts. How many people like coffee? How many people like beer? Okay. So these are not absolutes, and that gives us hope. If we can learn to like certain bitter things, we can learn to like other bitter things. And we can learn maybe to like sweet things a little bit less. But why do we love sweet and salty so much? Well, these things, as I said, signal nutrients, and our preferences develop very early in life. And they reflect our great need for energy and nutrients while we're growing as infants. In fact, children prefer levels of sweetness that are much higher even than an adult prefers. If you were to ask a child to create a beverage that had its optimal level of sugar, it would actually end up, you would add 7 more tablespoons of sugar than is present in a normal cola beverage. And that's what that child would rate as the most preferred. Millions of years ago, when food was scarce and intermittent and energy demands were much higher, you can imagine that this would be a survival mechanism. The animals that were the best at seeking these high caloric sources out would be most likely to survive. But in today's environment of food surplus, not so much. It can become a problem. So I think recognizing what we're working with and the strength of these learned and inborn behaviors can help us to overcome it. If you're thinking about adjusting or improving the diet of children, you have to think about improving the food landscape. And Shiriki will talk a little bit more about things from that perspective. But you can also think about using learning and memory to make associations with foods that will help the child to adapt and enjoy a certain type of food that it might not naturally prefer. So in addition to taste, our sense of smell provides a second very important aspect of flavor. It gives you the nuance and the richness of flavors. If you have no sense of smell, you can't tell a lemon from a lime. You can't discriminate unsweetened chocolate from coffee. How sad would that be? And the sense of smell is driven by nerve cells that live up here in the top part of your nose. And these are actually primary nerve cells that connect directly to the brain. And they're unique in that they actually are replaced throughout life. It's such an important system that we've developed a way of continually replacing these cells as they may be damaged by the environment and so forth. And we detect odors through two pathways, both what we call the orthonasal pathway through the front of the nose and the retronasal pathway as we're eating food. And this retronasal pathway actually provides very integral flavor information that the brain uses to synthesize with the vision, the visual, and the auditory, and the texture of the food to create a single flavor entity that the brain interprets as that flavor. And that's why if you lose your sense of smell, people often will say food doesn't taste the same. It's actually their sense of taste may be perfectly good, but without that retronasal odor input, the brain doesn't even recognize it as a flavor that it recognizes. So why are our food preferences so different? We know that we're not all the same. Some people love apple pie, some people love pumpkin pie. I'm not a pumpkin pie person, personally. And the reason for this is both biology and experience. So the genes that specify many of our taste and odor receptors can exist in different flavors or different varieties between individuals. And it can be said that our experience of flavor is as unique as our fingerprints. So no two individuals experience our flavor world in quite the same way. In addition, of course, experience sets the stage for what we decide is acceptable food or not acceptable. And it also influences how our genes are translated into proteins. So our experience, if we're repeatedly exposed to certain flavor qualities, that can actually change the amount of receptor protein that's being made and change our perception. As an example of our genetic influences, we can see that this is showing some data from individuals that vary in a particular bitter receptor. And this bitter receptor is sensitive to chemicals in these green vegetables that often are found to be bitter. How many people love broccoli? Just plain old straight up broccoli. How many people can't stand it? Yep, we've got a few of us out there. And you can see in each case, the blue bars are the sensitive people, the purple bars are the people with the insensitive version of this receptor. They rate the vegetables more bitter when they have the sensitive version of that receptor. Experience, the best way to influence is through early exposure. Start young. We know that flavors are transmitted in amniotic fluid and in mother's milk. And that's the best way. Exposure to diverse flavors before birth and during lactation is a great way to set up a child to accept those flavors later on in life. But most of us appear to be older than the than the sensitive period, which is about 4 months. So what do we do now that we're past 4 months? Well, there's a number of things that we can do. Shiriki will talk a little bit more about access in the food landscape and how we can provide education to change people's perceptions. But the latest finding that's very exciting is that we can also change how we detect tastes. This is just showing that over time, when people are on a low sodium diet, this is preference, the preferred level of salt in food actually decreased 20%. It took several months to do this, but this gave people who are salt-sensitive hypertensives hope that they could shift their diet and still enjoy a lower level of salt in the food. So to conclude, we know that both internal and external factors influence our dietary choices. And what's more recently being focused on is how these internal and external factors are actually changing our sensory systems and they can adapt and be more flexible than we realized to respond to both our internal needs and the external environment. And so these factors are giving us hope, really, that if we can understand this and we can start to leverage it, we actually can make the kinds of changes both in our food supply, in our dietary systems, in our educational practices that will be able to really move the needle and have a significant positive impact on our diet. So thank you very much for listening, and I think we'll have questions later.
Thank you, Nancy. Now, that was a really great overview of some of the basic biology of taste and smell, but also a perspective on how some of them can be more flexible than we might have thought. But that's always faced against the landscape of food that we have access to. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Shiriki Kumanyika, who will give us an insight into the window of food access and nutrition.
One more, okay. Let's see. So, I'd like to thank you as well for coming out on this rainy night and after Thanksgiving to talk about food. I'd love to hear from you what interests you in this topic. It is a global issue. I'm going to talk about it from a U.S. public health perspective. Our science is not as sexy, and it's controversial, and maybe 30–40% of you here don't believe some of the science that we put out in public health. But I'm going to convince you that you should. So I call this talk a tug of war because we are really dealing with these three sets of actors. The consumer is the boss. The consumer is the leader and the guide, and is working with those sensory perceptions that Nancy talked about. The food system, especially food companies, food manufacturing companies, food and beverage companies, are willing to meet the consumer more than halfway in terms of meeting the current sensory perceptions. And I think that's a fundamental issue that I'm going to leave you with after this short talk is where are the boundaries of how these sensory perceptions can be manipulated from the perspective of the food system, which is driven by not taste and affordability and convenience and pleasure as consumers, but production, profit, market share, competitiveness. And on the public health side, we're trying to influence both sets of actors. Our mandate is to sort of protect people from their senses if their senses are leading them to eat foods where when you look at diet X, more people die early than the people who eat diet Y. I mean, that's a simple public health nutrition epidemiology. So we follow dietary guidelines, we create dietary guidelines about what to eat, and we want to have that embedded into standards for what foods can be offered in schools and served. Probably food safety is where consumers, the food system and consumers align, but that's not so much these days a matter of taste. It was the matter of survival perhaps a long time ago, but that's not now not a matter of that. It's all I have to do is to say romaine lettuce. And I bet nobody in here had any for Thanksgiving dinner. So we're aligned on food safety, if we can get the message out. So our dietary guidelines are updated every 5 years by congressional mandate to see if the science that we have telling us what to eat is still valid, or have new studies come out that discredit that, and also to see if there are new issues that we should be taken into account. If there's something we're missing. And I actually studied nutrition when we were still studying vitamins and discovering vitamins, and one of my teachers was a person who had been involved in the discovery of folic acid. So there could be something new out there we don't know, and so the dietary guidelines committees look for that and to see, is there something new? They're becoming more and more controversial because of those three actors. The food system is geared to produce a certain type of food that appeals to consumers. We public health people are out there saying that's all wrong. And we've got to figure out, it is a matter of survival of all of us, how we can figure out how to better align that, and maybe Monell Science can help us with that. So in the old days, and I don't know if anybody here is old enough to remember the basic 7, the 7 food groups, basic 4 food groups, the dietary guidance used to be much simpler. The idea was that all food is good food, but you have to have a balance to get your vitamins and minerals, and you have to have enough to get your energy. And some of the early food programs, like food stamps, were created to make sure that people had enough to eat and got the dietary balance. It wasn't so complicated. Around the late 1970s and 1980s, food guidance really had a sea change because the chronic diseases, the cardiovascular diseases, cancer, diabetes, and so forth, really took over the conversation about how people should be eating because of the evidence around the world that people's diets were associated with these diseases. So this, the middle panel, the cover of the 1980 Dietary Guidelines brochure, has a really ugly word in it from a food point of view: avoid. And that was, putting that word on that brochure was controversial, because now you're going to prejudice one type of food against another. You're going to start giving a negative message to consumers. And I was on one of the committees after that, and I did my doctoral studies actually on sodium and salt intake. So you have avoid too much fat, avoid too much sugar, and avoid too much sodium. Most people didn't even know what sodium was, but that was the way we were communicating at that time. And then the food pyramid, which used to be on every package of bread and so forth, that became some of the new guidance. And what's different, it's still several food groups and giving you a sense of the balance, how you should get your calories from these different food groups. But the little sprinkles at the top are sugar and fat. They're representing the things that you should, use sparingly. So the language was still very, very gentle, not wanting to send a message to people about what they shouldn't be eating. So salt was not one of those sprinkles. That worried me. They couldn't get salt on there, either because of food politics or because someone made a decision that it wasn't important yet, even though we had the science to back it up. But the efforts to reduce the average salt intake have been going on for quite some time. The Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, really issued a strategic plan for how to lower the sodium intake in the food supply. And that was using the kind of science, probably using some of those very studies, to say, gradually, let's remove it from the food supply, and people won't notice it, and it'll change their preference. But everybody has to do that for it to work. Because if you've got one soup company out there making very salty soup, and you eat that, it's going to kick your preferences back up. So the National Salt Reduction Initiative works with industry voluntarily to try to reduce, and not necessarily tell consumers because they'll think the food's going to be bland. You can see the top 10 sources, so they are very commonly consumed foods, and that sandwich has about 65% of your daily recommended sodium intake, so you can see how hard it is. Sugar is also, some people would say, under attack, but it's certainly of concern to public health. And this is actually from the World Cancer Research Fund report on curbing global sugar consumption, because obesity is one of the major risk factors for cancer, and extra sugar, added sugar, leads to weight gain, leads to obesity, leads to cancer. The graph on the right side is from the US data, and it shows the two big parts of the pie are the major sources of added sugar. When you look at all the foods people eat, the major food sources of added sugar are snacks and sweets and beverages, not counting milk and 100% fruit juice. So we're talking about foods that you can identify more easily for sugar. Salt's in almost everything, but these foods in sugar, but they're not foods that are going to be easily taken away from the diet. What do consumers think? About half of the consumers in a Gallup poll were trying to reduce their salt, and about 40% trying to reduce their sugar. Not too many differences, but where I've circled, college grads were the most likely to be trying to reduce sugar, and Black Americans are most likely to be reducing salt. And I remember hearing as a child, salt is bad for you because high blood pressure was very common in the Black community, and so I think that's why that's really embedded in the Black community. It doesn't say they're succeeding, but say they're trying. So we have two tasks. One is to help the people who are trying to reduce these things to reduce them, and the other is to convert the other 60 or 50% that they should be trying to reduce them. Another troubling concern is who can actually manage to avoid these substances. And this is a hunger report, Hunger Free America report about Philadelphia that was released on November 12th, I believe, or very recently, and Librano had an article in the Inquirer about it, reminding us that Philadelphia has the highest poverty rate of the 10 major cities in the US, and that is partly reflected in the number of people who are food insecure. So people who are price sensitive and who have, depending on food banks, have a harder time because these shelf-stable foods, manufactured foods that people can get more cheaply, are the foods that are high in salt and sugar. That was just a picture of the Inquirer article. And I want to conclude with this slide because the food industry is not agnostic to what foods you eat because of where the profit is. And adding good tasting stuff to food sells it better. Most of the foods advertised are the less healthy foods if you were to score the foods. And some of the marketing is especially targeted to populations who are perceived by food companies to be better customers for some of the unhealthy food. So it's very easy to document target marketing, disproportionately high levels of marketing of high fat, high sugar, high salt foods to Black children, Black adults, some of these foods to Latino adults, and to and in some cases to low-income children. And this was a study that we did with showing low-income communities were having a higher level of marketing geographically on the local spot ads, not on national cable. So I'll conclude there. We have plenty of time for discussion, and I hope I have energized you to think about what survival means in terms of food in 2018. Thank you.
So I'd like to join Nancy and Shiriki on stage here. And I have some questions to start this discussion, but I invite you to join us by sending us your questions. Pull out your device for here, and email us at speakerseries@fi.edu or tweet at us with #TalkFI. But we've got a lot to unpack. You left us with a lot of questions. And I want to start out diving in a little bit more into this trade-off between genetics and experience in terms of what shapes our preference. And you're probably all wondering about these two little strips that you were given when you walked in. And so let's go ahead and start there. Nancy, can you tell us a little bit about what we're going to do and what this tells us about ourselves?
Sure. So I I showed the graph that shows that certain people are more or less sensitive to certain bitter compounds, and that influences how we respond to many vegetables. It turns out these same receptors are present throughout our body. And recently, work from Monell has shown that a simple taste test can actually tell us about how we're going to respond to certain types of infections, because these same receptors are responsible for detecting bitter compounds that are released by bacteria. So if you want to know where you might stand in this test, take out one of the strips that's got a dot on it, either a black dot or an orange dot. Did everybody get one? Okay, we need a few more. Raise your hand if you need one. So what you're going to do, and we're going to do this first, is you're going to take this little piece of paper and you're going to put it on your tongue.
Yes, she's coming around with extras. Keep your hand raised high if you need one, so we can see you.
So put it in your mouth and close your mouth for a few seconds.
Ellen, two more up there.
Two more behind you.
Okay. And I'm doing it.
More.
We're doing it.
You don't have to lick the dot. You just have to use the
No, just hold it by the dot and put it on your tongue. Close your mouth for a minute.
Okay.
So a few seconds. Take the one with a dot. Some people have a black dot, some have an orange dot. Doesn't matter. Just put it. Yeah. Just hold it by the dot and put the rest of the paper in your mouth. On your tongue, and then close your mouth.
So what should we expect?
So.
It tastes like paper to me.
Tastes like paper.
Paper.
Tastes like paper. Sweet. Horrible. So this is just a piece of paper.
Okay. You faked us out.
But I was actually doing a little experiment, I knew. How many people had a black dot? Okay. So the people often are more likely to rate something as bitter if it's black in food, when it comes to food. And if you have an orange dot, how many people had an orange dot? The guy that thought it was sweet had an orange dot. People are more likely to rate things as sweet or sour if they're orange in color or yellow.
So that gets at all of the different factors that influence our taste perception.
Right.
Fascinating.
So, okay, put that somewhere.
I'll ask you to maybe put it back in your bag just to save our cleaning staff.
Yes.
The trouble with things off the ground.
Take the other strip out that has no dot on it and do the same thing. Either end. Put the whole thing in your mouth. Just let it sit there for about 10 seconds. Let it get nice and wet.
I sense some super tasters in the audience.
What did you taste? How many people thought it was just another piece of paper? Yep, looks like about 25%. How many people thought it was really, really bitter?
Wow.
Okay. How many people thought it was something,
It had something
maybe
on it,
bitter,
yeah.
but not horrible?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so it turns out in a given population, it's about, the percentages range. And in Caucasians, it's about 25% of the people can't detect that bitter compound at all. And about 3/4 of the people can detect it. But of those, about 25% are really sensitive, like I am. Like I can still taste, like my tongue is so bitter right now that I would really like something sweet to eat.
And if anybody
pass out
had
the candy, right?
if anybody had a really bitter taste, we have mints.
You have
If you'd
mints.
like a mint,
Raise your hand. We'll pass out mints. So the other interesting thing is that this does vary. The frequencies do vary in populations. And it was interesting what Shiriki was mentioning, because Hispanics and African Americans are more likely to be sensitive to this bitter compound and are more likely to rate it as more intense than in a higher proportion. So some of these genetic differences do also play into our food preferences. Okay.
So keep your hands
get a
raised
mint.
if you
your
want
hands
a mint.
up.
Mints are
We
coming
need
around.
mints.
We thought of everything.
And so do we see that some of those population-based preferences are then reflected in the types of food that are common in different parts of the world?
It certainly does influence food preferences, but there's a lot of factors, obviously, that influence food preferences. And exposure here is another critical factor, because it turns out that if you are in this middle zone of moderate sensitivity, if you're someone who eats a lot of plant materials that have a lot of these chemicals in them, over time, you'll actually become sort of adapted to them, and you'll be able to accept them.
So some of this experience, you might expect to see that people who are vegetarians might have different taste preferences. When you look back at our evolutionary history, do you also see differences between the taste receptors in carnivores versus herbivores, or is that something that we've learned more recently?
So herbivores obviously eat a lot of these plant materials that have many of these potentially toxic and toxic chemicals that are bitter. They have very few, if in some cases no, bitter receptors. So they can't detect these compounds. They're sensing other things about the foods, and they also have very high concentrations of the enzymes that you need to detoxify those chemicals. So yes, there is differences. Carnivores actually do detect bitter compounds, and they tend to be different types of bitter compounds, but they also detect bitter compounds.
So one thing that you mentioned, that you both mentioned as kind of at the interface of where the two of you are working, is this idea of maybe manipulating our taste receptors in the service of health. And one example that I think many of us are familiar with are artificial sweeteners. Can you talk from your different perspectives about the science behind the development of those kinds of chemicals, but also the social perception of some of those artificial foods in an environment where we often hear artificial as being a bad word?
Why don't you start?
Well, the only thing I have seen documented in my own work about artificial sweeteners is that there's a less of a acceptance of diet beverages in African Americans. I don't think that's been totally unpacked, but part of it might be because it's called artificial, and there is an interest in things that are authentic. But also, I think it's there's something bitter. There's something in that seems to just go against that. So a lot of soda consumption, soft drink consumption, is higher than average in African Americans, and the acceptance of the alternative, which is no sugar, is lower in like the national survey data and so forth. Maybe Nancy can explain that.
Well, there is a difference in the degree of sensitivity to the bitter component of those artificial sweeteners, the high potency sweeteners, and that does vary across these populations. So I think that certainly plays into it. I think some of the other types of high potency sweeteners are the newer ones, which is where some of the new science is coming in, are not working so much with the structure of the chemical as they are with the ability of the compound to be dissolved in the saliva. And so just recently a type of sugar was developed which is physically, it's chemically it's the same as sugar, but physically the structure is such that it's able to reach the receptors much more effectively. So you can reduce the sugar content without reducing the intensity of the sweetness. So that's the type of development that's very exciting.
And so is it then possible for our bitter super tasters in the room to develop something that blocks that particular receptor to make bitter foods taste better?
Yes, so there's two sides of that. So the short answer is yes. And we've been working, and others have been working, to develop specific bitter blockers, not so much for foods initially, but for medicines that have to be given to children in liquid form. And these medicines are very bitter and very unpleasant tasting. So that's where the science has started to develop those selective bitter blockers. But it's important to realize that, again, as I mentioned, these receptors are present throughout the body. So you don't necessarily want to block their function everywhere. So if you do develop something that suppresses the sensitivity in the mouth, you want to make sure that it's not having a negative effect on these other receptors in the gut that are important in helping to protect you from bacterial infection.
So I thought it was interesting when you talked about how, Shiriki, how to start making these gradual changes, it has to be a collective decision to start to make these changes. And I wanted to follow that thread into some questions of social policy. And we have a question from the audience that I think is very relevant here in Philadelphia, where we have a relatively recent tax on soda and sugary beverages. So what have been the findings of using taxes to try and change people's behavior?
They work.
Short answer.
There are a lot of dossiers or briefs being put together now cataloging the experience with the taxes. They're hard to evaluate because you have to rule out so many other things, like you have to show who's buying them, and maybe if they live near the county border and his tax doesn't go outside the county, so it's very difficult to evaluate. But in general, I think economists knew this before, and certainly the beverage companies knew it because of the millions of dollars that they put into avoiding the taxes, is that consumption would go down. It doesn't go down to the extent that there'll be no tax because there'll be no purchases, but certain users, I guess, who are in the zone where they can change their behavior or they're so price sensitive that they can't afford that product anymore, don't want to afford it, they actually work to change behavior. In their studies in the US, it's from Berkeley, California. Their studies on Navajo and Philadelphia, some early results, I believe, are showing differences in purchases. First you have to look at, is the tax passed through to the consumer? Does it cost the consumer more? And then the purchase is lower, and then you actually want to get consumption behavior. So we haven't had enough time, I think, to fully show that. But where you have these taxes, there's pretty good evidence that they work. One question is, what is the alternative? Philly is taxing artificially sweetened beverages as well. The tax design in Philly, just everything in a can or whatever, however it's done, or a bottle, and that is going to be harder to tease out than the taxes where they only apply to the sweet beverages.
So that's an interesting policy application of the difference between artificial and sweeteners and added sugars.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's an attempt to change behavior at the personal consumer level, but you've also done some recent work in establishing benchmarks for food production companies. Can you tell us a little bit about how that's changing the food production system?
Well, in the U.S., we haven't had enough time to see this because the report that you're speaking of was just released on the 16th of November.
Hot off the presses.
Hot off the presses, but if anybody in the audience wants to look at it, you can just go to accesstonutrition.org, and you will see the U.S. report. This is a U.S. Spotlight report. So I'll just give a quick background. Benchmarking companies is something that investors are interested in, and it's being used to help shape the business models of various companies. So climate change, carbon footprint indices and other types of sustainability indices and so forth. So benchmarking has been brought into the area of nutrition friendliness of the major food companies. So this index, for which I'm an advisor, rates the 25 largest food companies in terms of sales globally, but the US index, which was funded by Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and just released, rates the 10 largest companies in the US. And the idea there is to use the competition that companies, natural competition among companies, give them a score that shows where they can improve. It's a very positive index. It's not a name and shame, industry bashing type of thing. It's this is what you're doing now, and this is what includes their policies. Like, is it in your business model? Does somebody report to the CEO about the nutritional quality of your products? And then we look at their products as well and score them on a health star rating to see how the companies are doing. And what we hope is that the highest score overall score was in the 5 to 6 range on a score of 10. So we're hoping that companies will strive to get 7, 8, 9, 10. And the reason I like that is because that is going through the business role. Public health can use it, but it's going through business models where companies are actually driven by profit and competitiveness to say, on the long term, the health of the population is as important to you as it is to a public health person.
So you're really trying to speak their language.
Speak their language and motivate, and hopefully it works. We have seen improvement in the global index over time. Some of the companies have really stepped out and done something different. They've bought a healthier product, so their portfolio is not quite so dependent on salt and sugar, or something like that.
So we have a number of questions here about the plasticity and the flexibility of our taste perceptions over time. Everything from what happens during pregnancy to what happens as you age. So maybe, Nancy, can you start us off thinking about how quickly those adaptations happen and how they relate to these more long-term changes that we see over evolutionary time?
Sure. So the hormonal environment, both in a short term and a longer term, alters our taste system and our olfactory system. So during pregnancy, for instance, obviously there's a lot of different hormonal changes going on there, and that can alter the expression of the receptors that are sensitive to bitter. So you might be more sensitive to bitter. You might have differences in your olfactory sensitivity, which we haven't really studied in great detail yet, but certainly we know that those effects can exist. What we have studied more so is looking at, with respect to aging, and this is some work that I did and others have done, but there's 2 factors that happen as we age. In general, because I mentioned that these cells turn over throughout life, both taste cells, so you have new taste cells every 10 days. The average taste cell lives about 10 days and you have a new one. Your olfactory neurons turn over about once a month. So this ability to regenerate of these systems tends to decline with age, like the ability of our skin to regenerate and everything else. So we know that generally with age, there can be a generalized decline in sensitivity. But in addition, over time, as we're exposed to certain compounds, for instance, in the olfactory pathway, if you smell, there's a particular odor called androstenone that's a musky odor that many people can't smell very much at all. But if they're exposed to it over a series of days, they become sensitive to it. So your system actually can tune itself to its environment. And this, you can imagine, is very important for a survival. You want to be able to detect the things in your environment that are important. And if a chemical that you have a receptor for isn't in your environment, you don't need to detect it, so it can go away. And that's happened on both an evolutionary scale as well as a more short-term, over months and years sort of scale. So it's a very, very plastic system, and it's really exciting. There's a lot more that we need to learn, though.
And on an even shorter time scale, I think we can all sympathize with that feeling of when we're sick or when we're stressed, we're craving those salty foods or fatty foods.
Right.
And what's the biological reason for that? But also for you, Shiriki, how does that fit into communities where there's just a generally higher level of stress?
Yeah, so recently, very exciting work is showing that stress, the inflammatory mediators that are activated by stress, that are released during stress and during infection, actually upregulate your taste system, selectively making you more sensitive to bitter compounds. So our stress makes us even less likely to eat the broccoli and what we should be eating, right? So it becomes sort of a vicious circle.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. there have been data showing that for whatever reason, without the science, the sensory science, the foods, the salt and fat and sweet foods work very well as stress reducers. And a lot of people know that from their own experience. There have been studies, a researcher out in San Francisco, Elisa Eppel, does research on this, and she's had medical students on days when they had exams and so forth. Other people who are really trying to see what would you eat if you put the candy and the broccoli in front of people, Well, maybe without the broccoli, but how much candy would you actually eat? And one of my colleagues has shown that parents who are stressed feed their children differently, and there seem to be two types. Some parents know that they're going to, pig out on ice cream, so they try to protect the children from that. Other parents eat it in front of the children and say, come on, everybody eat it, because that's a stress reducer. And I think that has tremendous potential for helping with a lot of conditions, because stress is probably the biggest actor in chronic diseases and inflammation and stuff. And if we're going to load on, the icing and the cake on top of that response, it works in the short term, but what is it doing in the long term?
So right now, we're actually looking at legislation in Congress right now with the Farm Bill that's up for debate right now. And one of the biggest components of the Farm Bill is actually money for supplemental nutrition. And can you comment on where some of the science is influencing how that policy is formed versus what are some of the proposals to make sure that we're really shifting towards supporting healthy nutrition as opposed to just calories?
I think the science right now has to do with the SNAP program, or formerly food stamps. And public health scientists and some economists and others are trying to look at whether restricting the foods that people can buy with the SNAP benefits would be beneficial to their health. It's a very complicated issue because the SNAP is an income transfer program, and it's meant to relieve stress by helping with the food budget. And so from my perspective, I was a social worker before I was in public health, so I take a very holistic perspective on this. I don't think that most of us, probably anybody in this room, have any idea what people are negotiating, people who are using, participating in SNAP, what they're negotiating in terms of daily survival. And so to take the food out in isolation and say, well, we don't want you to buy soft drinks with our tax money, to me is a too narrow view of the issue. So I would say that this is where science really needs to talk to the consumer and find out where are the trade-offs. Because, for example, one study we did, a decision experiment, we showed people flashcards with different prices of foods of different types, and some were healthy and some weren't, and we asked them which one would you buy. And, for example, the artificially sweetened soft drinks, you could have had them for free, people would still have chosen the other one, Yeah. So, some things are hardwired, and I think, but the policy is looking at, is there a way to make it healthier? And I feel that simplistic science without looking at the whole picture could make things worse without intending to. That's my personal opinion from the way I read the science.
Do you see that in the science? Are scientists who are working in this field thinking about some of these complex social factors that go into nutrition?
They certainly are, and I think one of the exciting things is increasingly going forward, the sensory scientists and the public health and the nutritionists really need to be in the same room more to really design the right kinds of studies, because so often, a sensory scientist is going to look at sweet taste, but they're not necessarily going to take into the factors of the culture and the social environment that may alter how that person responds to those products or those sensory experiences in a real world setting. So we're not there yet, but I think there's hope because we're starting to talk to each other much more so.
And probably also not taking into account the target marketing, which is one of my pet peeves, because if you are being bombarded with messages on all the channels that you get. Now you can get it right in your phone if you're near the aisle where they have the sweets. Are you here? And especially for the kids, they really, respond to that because they live, with their phones in front of them all the time. But so the marketing is having an influence, and that has to be taken into consideration. So that you don't get into a sort of blaming the victim situation where people are responding in a normal way, but that is criticized, because of, policymakers don't like it or something. Yeah.
So that's actually a good segue into another question, which is, do you face pushback from people who are really in favor of a message of body positivity? That when you talk about some of these health risks that come from obesity, how do you reconcile that with these positive images of body perspective that influence both our psychological and physical health as well?
Yeah, I think in the obesity field, the first thing we've done is to adopt what's called people first language. I don't know if you've heard of it, but we no longer talk about obese people. We talk about people with obesity like we would talk about people with diabetes or people with something else, defining it as a condition that people have and not as an adjective to, about them. And we're working a lot more with advocates from the community of people with obesity who are speaking for themselves and trying to help shape the types of strategies, the type of language, the type of images. It is one of the subjects that is subject to so much bias, implicit bias and explicit bias, so we have a long way to go. If we think getting rid of people liking very sweet foods is difficult, I think also getting rid of the stigma that's associated with having a high body weight is as well. So we're trying to work on that, and the goals, there are many ways to achieve health. So physical activity is promoted, that will have a benefit even if no weight is lost. And so there is a sense of health at any size, while we do want to help people who want to lose weight and can lose weight to use the tools that are there.
What's your perspective from the science side? Does it often feel that the scientific perspective is taking it from too much of a clinical perspective and not enough of the whole person?
I think a lot of the science has focused too much on drug of the week, next drug target. And I totally agree. We need a holistic perspective. And I think people are starting to talk more about metabolic health as more of an important definition and target than simply body weight. And I think that's a good direction.
So we've got a couple more questions about some of these interesting taste preferences that I want to hit on, because I think a lot of people share these questions. So one is something like cilantro, that people tend to either love it or hate it. Is that a real thing?
It's absolutely a real thing. And it's one of those funny little studies that a Monell scientist did to figure out that there is a specific odor receptor that detects a chemical in cilantro. And if you have that receptor in a functioning form, you're very sensitive to that chemical, and it smells like soap. and so we say it tastes soapy, but it's really an odor. It's a soapy odor. Many people have a version of that receptor that doesn't detect that chemical, or detects it very, very slightly, and to them, cilantro is just fine.
I mean, if you ask me, there's never such a thing as too much cilantro.
So I know something about your DNA then.
But it's an interesting transition because I come from an Indian culture where cilantro is very heavily used, and so my husband married into this culture, and so it's been a little bit of an adaptation for him. And so we've got another question: that is there ever too late to adjust your preferences?
It's never too late. No. Actually, my dad is 97 this week, and he was asking me. I told him about this, and he was asking me, and he said, "Well, I've really learned to like less sodium, and I don't really like sugar that much anymore because I've been reading and I worry, I'm concerned, and so he's actually taken steps and has a very healthy diet and eats a variety of flavors and puts a lot of lemon juice on things instead of salt, and so he's learned to adapt. And so, no, I would say it's never too late.
And so one last follow-up on this is that could we think about spiciness as a flavor? And does that have some kind of evolutionary function to detect?
Yes, so that's the chemical sense that I didn't mention because of the time constraints. There's a third chemical sense, which we call chemesthesis, which is carried by a different nerve system, the trigeminal system, which carries things like pain, temperature, heat, cold. And these are chemicals like menthol and clove and ginger and hot pepper, capsaicin, that give you that tingle and that burn. And these definitely can add a lot of interest to food in the as an alternative to salt and sugar. And that's definitely something that is, I think, a good direction for a lot of people to go.
Yeah. So I want to share that someone tweeted at us that having used SNAP benefits earlier in life, that in their experience that they did in fact eat better because they had healthier foods in the house. And so I appreciate you sharing your experience with us, because I think another question that I'd like to talk about is, Shiriki, you mentioned the issue of hunger here in Philadelphia. Can you talk about some initiatives going on in our city here that are aimed at trying to reduce some of that hunger and poverty?
Yeah, Philadelphia has a very active community nutrition group. Community gardens are not going to solve the problem of hunger, but they do have social benefits and some food benefits and get people involved with food and so forth. There's a lot of nutrition education that goes on, including to children in low-income communities for acceptability of certain types of foods that are available through farmers markets or food share programs. Because there are two issues. One is if children, for example, haven't been exposed to healthy foods, then when they get food, they wouldn't know what to do with it or wouldn't like it. So creating within the population that is living in poverty or food insecure a liking for a wide variety of foods that they could be exposed to, maybe can't afford, and then also working with the people who distribute charitable food to get more of that food into the food pantries. I believe there is the National Food Pantry or Food Bank system is Feeding America, and I know that there have been some initiatives to get nutrition policies. But it's a policy dilemma because if people are donating food and you're turning food away because it doesn't meet the dietary guidelines, that's socially not acceptable. But then it's also not acceptable to say to people, because you need to visit a food pantry sometime during the month. A lot of college students, they have food pantries now on college campuses. There are a lot of people who can't afford to eat regularly all the time, and in places where you wouldn't expect it. So how do you work with the donors to food banks to change the mix of foods so that there's more healthy food available? And how do you work with the food banks to get that to happen? And I know the Food Trust, for example, has been working with food banks, doing audits of the food they have, looking at what's offered, looking at possibilities of training people who work in the food banks about how to help clients select healthy foods and so forth. So I think that Philadelphia, it's kind of sad that if you saw that article that I showed, that the rate of food insecurity has actually increased in Philadelphia, according to this report, where it's been decreasing other places in the past few years, and it's decreased in the state of Pennsylvania. So the rates are high, and they're increasing, and the rates are lower in other parts of Pennsylvania, and they have been going down. That's the way I read it. I haven't had a chance to really study that. So in spite of the efforts of the Food Trust and other organizations, the Hunger Coalition, and so forth, and the Mayor's Food Policy Council, are all working on these efforts, but probably it's going to be a food system solution because food pantries are not a permanent solution. So it's going to be a food system solution that will require working with the commercial and retail outlets, and some of that's been done as well, putting healthier food there. But food insecurity, if people don't have enough money to buy food, and for one reason or another are not having food stamp or SNAP participation, or it's not lasting long enough, then it's really a systems problem that has to be looked at that way.
And when we talked earlier, you mentioned a project from the Neighborhood Gardens Trust, where people can look at what the quality of their food environment is on a local basis.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Along with some colleagues, we've developed a tool called Environment Supporting Healthy Eating, ESHE. And it's also web-based. We've just transferred it to a new platform, but it's probably up by now. You could work with a community group to assess the food environment. You can benchmark your county against other counties, but then you can use field audits and go out with community members to see what's there. And what the Neighborhood Gardens Trust did was to go out and audit community gardens, find out which ones were the most viable, and to try to make sure that they had the land, the rights to the land to keep those gardens up, and then they help other gardens to become more stable. But the land use is really big because, as you know, real estate in Philadelphia is very costly, and you could wake up one morning and your garden is gone if you don't have a lease on that little piece of land. So that's one of the projects, and the idea that community members can be more aware of what their food situation is by using the tools that we've developed or pointed them to is something we'd like to see more uptake of, because that awareness then creates demand from the system. The system isn't going to work unless there's demand. So
that's kind of the bottom-up approach.
Yeah, that's the bottom-up approach, right.
Now, if you think about the food system approach, Nancy, I'd like to get your take on what you've seen in the work that you're doing and that Monell is doing in terms of partnering with some of these, whether it's corporations or policy level.
Right. So actually picking up on the exposure and the food in the environment idea, we've done work with schools in school systems and showed that really just repeated exposure to healthy foods increases acceptance over time. And I think having the food in the environment, even if you're not eating it every single day, but becoming more familiarity makes you more likely to accept it, especially for children. But it works for everyone too. I think the studies have shown that just 10 exposures actually can make a meaningful shift in acceptance of a food item that might not initially be liked. So I think that's a big part of it, and I think also, as Shiriki said, you have to work with the corporations and understand that you can't just expect them to go out of business. You have to find ways to make it beneficial to them as well. And I think more companies are stepping up. I think we will see this. It's driven more out of Europe right now. Yeah. But the U.S. companies, I think that all of the companies that we work with have very strong initiatives in place to look at this and to try to better shift how they make the products, having more varieties, more options for the products, so that you can have these choices be made, and to shift as we get the data on the sugar intake too over time. It will help the companies and the public health people know what's reasonable. Again, because just yelling at people to stop eating sugar isn't really going to work. Right? Right? You have to do it in a way that's feasible, and so it takes time, but it's moving in the right direction.
Yeah. Could I add something, because it's interesting when you mentioned the index. So 9 of the 10 U.S. companies are also rated in the global index because they work globally. Mm-hmm. And one of our findings was that the companies are now doing less in the U.S. to support nutrition than they are in some of their other markets. Right. So that kind of comparison is very interesting because it means that it can be done, but it's perhaps what the companies are picking up from the culture in these other places. I mean, sweetened beverages have different levels of sugar in different places as well. So that's another possibility to learn from their European counterparts or other markets, right?
So some of the issues that we were talking about earlier about different populations in different parts of the world having different taste perceptions then gets matched to what products they're being sold.
That's what I'm thinking, because it's pretty clear that the scores were just overall lower, and there's some reasons for that. But I think one of our conclusions was that they're doing less, and it may also be from a policy perspective what is tolerated in terms of products and marketing may differ across different markets. So.
Wow. So I think one of the reasons that this topic has fascinated me is that you start with this basic brain function of perception and of taste and smell that goes back, way back in evolutionary history, and yet when we're looking at where that brings us today, we're looking at this immensely tangled web of decisions that are being made from the consumer level, at the community level, at the global level, and I think it's a great example of how science and society, are just intertwined in ways that we can't even imagine when we're just thinking about the science. So I'd like to thank you both for bringing your perspectives to this issue and helping us start to tease apart this landscape. So with that, I'd like to give our speakers both a round of applause. Thank you.